Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. My name is Eliza and I have the privilege of managing the team of the National Eating Disorders Collaboration. There's some familiar faces in the room here that will know me, but others, welcome. It's lovely to see you in here. A big part of what the NEDC does, and you will have heard from Christine to give a nice overview, but we do all sorts of things, and a big part of that is information dissemination, knowledge sharing, and also face-to-face forums and professional development. As I have had the privilege to work in all sorts of regional aspects and areas of Australia, there's a resounding feedback that I get, and that is often we need introductory information, and that's the session next door with Chris Thornton. But we also need some specialised information, some information where we can put some tools in our toolkit. And so today in this session, I look forward to introducing Gabby and Beth to you, who will give you a snapshot and hopefully some tools that you can learn from today and grow on today. But firstly, let me introduce you to our first speaker, as it's mentioned here, Gabriella Heruc. She has a distinguished career. She's been working in the area of eating disorders now and mental health for over 20 years. Gabby is an accredited practicing dietitian with also an interest in psychology. She has an interest in research as well and currently studying towards her PhD, and I will welcome you to have conversations with Gabby about that. But she also plays a key role in the area of private practice and working closely with those affected by an eating disorder, but also with the Sydney Children's Hospital program in Crow's Nest as well. So it is my pleasure to welcome Gabby up here, and she is going to talk to you today. She's going to bust some myths. So one of the key feedback that we often get as we travel across the country is, gosh, we need more information about nutritional management. So she will shed some light on that today. Thank you, Gabby.
So I think we've got quite a diverse number of people in this room and people from all kinds of different backgrounds. Can I have a show of hands first? How many people are dietitians in the room, first of all? Excellent. So this talk is not aimed at you. But saying that, I'm sure you might have a laugh, and it might be actually quite good for you to think through some of these things as well. And certainly in even putting this presentation together, I had to delve into some research that I hadn't looked at in a while, so it was nice to have a little bit of an update. How about people from the medical profession? How many GPs are in the room? Paediatricians? Psychiatrists? No psychiatrists today? Oh, one? Psychologists? Lots of psychologists. Social workers? OTs? Nurses? Lived experience? Cool, we got kind of everything going on here, haven't we? All right, so look, this is why I've done today's talk on nutrition myths, is I thought, you know what, I need to think about what is the general population worried about with nutrition? What's the general population thinking about with nutrition? What's really going to be applicable for all? And I think one of the things that we see in clinical practice that's so problematic at times is patients coming in and having been told inappropriate or incorrect or inaccurate information. And it often can become very triggering for them and leads to all kinds of new beliefs that they take on board. So I thought I might put a bunch of myths out there and go through them with you and explore what might the truth really be. All right, so let's get into this. So the hidden truths, dispelling nutrition myths in an over-informed world. How many of you feel like this when you think about nutrition? When you think about all the things that come out in the media, in the news, social media things pop up on your Facebook page. It's pretty confusing. It's pretty daunting. This is the definition of confusion from the Oxford Dictionary. Uncertainty about what is happening, intended or required, a situation of panic or disorder, a disorderly jumble, the state of being bewildered or unclear in one's mind about something, the mistaking of one person or thing for another, I think that's how a lot of people feel about all of the food stories and food bits of information that come out there.
And it changes all the time.
It changes all the time.
One day it's good for you, the next time is, oh no, definitely not. You know?
That's right, it's always changing, always changing. So, this was actually looked at in the US back in 2012, and they found that 3 out of 4 consumers feel that changes in nutritional guidance makes it hard to know what to believe. And half believe it's easier to do their own taxes than to figure out how to eat healthily. This was one of the remarks during that study that they had from one of their participants. Well, they seem to change their mind all the time. First, it's all about not eating fat. Then they tell you some fats are okay, others are not. Okay, so then you have to try and figure out which fats are good, which are bad, and how much fat you can eat. Then it's sugar. So now you have to look at how much sugar the food has. Then it's fibre. So it's time to start seeing how much fibre food has. So does that mean you have to look at fat, sugar and fibre together? Like at this point, it's no wonder some of our patients don't eat anything. So what do eating disorder clinicians actually know? What do you think? Do you guys think you know the truth? So a couple of studies have actually looked at this. One was done in the UK, looking at 65 clinicians. They surveyed them. They all worked in eating disorders, and they all completed a measure of knowledge of nutritional content of foods. And what they found was, probably not surprisingly, dietitians had the highest level of knowledge regarding carbohydrate, protein and fat. Psychiatrists were next best informed. But clinical psychologists and nurses were no better than the lay group. And in fact, links between nutrition knowledge level and there were links found between nutrition knowledge level and the clinician's own eating attitudes. So your own beliefs were informing what you were believing to be true and sharing with patients. This was also repeated in Australia, actually, back in 2011, and 111 health professionals working with eating disorders were surveyed, including also 34 individuals with an eating disorder and 116 controls. In this study, they found that non-dietitian health professionals had similar knowledge levels to individuals with an eating disorder. It's probably not going to help you to dispel the myths and beliefs that our patients have. All right, so how do we debunk these myths? So a nutrition myth may have circulated for years, passed from person to person. To displace a myth, you have to create a credible replacement. Think about all the influences on your own food beliefs. All the experiences you've been through in your life, personal experiences, things you've seen others going through, let alone when you bring into it media and things in the magazines and newspapers, TV, radio. We create our own patterns of eating influenced by our family, peers and environment. And in an eating disorder, these become food rules, which are driven by emotions and negative reinforcement, so not particularly helpful. So let me ask you this. What do you in the room think is normal, healthy eating? Just think about it for a moment. Let me put up 2 scenarios. What does a normal healthy eater look like? Do they engage in dietary restraint, monitor caloric intake, avoid high-fat food, have a fairly low carbohydrate intake, minimal salt intake, drinks at least 2 litres of water per day, has high protein intake, takes a daily multivitamin? Based on all those nutrition messages out there that we get from the media, sounds pretty healthy, right? Or is a healthy eater someone who has a balanced diet, has lots of dietary variety, listens to and trusts their body, eats when they're hungry, stops when they're full, eat what they want when they want it, and respectful of taste preferences? They allow themselves to like foods, enjoy foods, listen to those senses. Which one's the healthy eater? So advertising. We get bombarded by so much stuff in the media, don't we? Real taste, 0 calories, right? Be fat without being fat. Okay. Low carb energy, there's a whole magazine devoted to that. Good carbs versus bad carbs. All right, so we're trying to figure out what we're supposed to do. We should be able to turn to the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, right? You know, the government puts this out, there's lots of time and money and research that's put into this, and it's there to educate us all, right? And tell us what we should and shouldn't be doing. So should we be following this? Here's my first myth for today. You need to follow the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. This is actually a myth. It was developed to be broadly used at a population level. It's not designed for the individual. So if you have a patient or a client sitting in front of you, this is not what you're meant to be turning to figure out what they need to eat. Every individual has different nutritional needs. You know, whether they have diabetes, cystic fibrosis, celiac disease, allergies. You have to think about so many different factors, and often our clients and patients have a whole combination of these. And yet everyone thinks that this Australian Guide to Healthy Eating is what we're meant to be following. So if you guys think this, imagine what our patients think. And imagine how they might interpret it. It certainly doesn't target their health concerns and needs, their osteoporosis, their malnutrition, their anxieties. So I'm definitely going to have to give credit to Susan Hart and Caitlin McMaster for this slide. I really love it. I presented with them last week at a conference, and Caitlin put this up, and I think it really clearly shows how our patients interpret this guide. So the guide says, can you all see this at the back? Yeah? The guide says use fats and oils in small amounts. So what do our patients think? Eliminate fats, compromising essential fatty acids and fat-soluble vitamins. Eat plenty of vegetables of different types and colours. Our patients think overconsume high-fibre foods, fruits and vegetables at the expense of other food groups. Choose reduced-fat dairy products. Patients might interpret this as limit dairy foods and choose skim options. Swap to products with a health halo. Choose lean meats. Avoid red meat. And choose vegetarianism and veganism. It's definitely the safer option, right? Or the healthier option. Drink plenty of water and limit drinks containing added sugar, soft drink, juice, cordial. How might patients see this? Excessive water and low-calorie fluids are the way to go. Limit foods containing saturated fat, added salt and added sugars. Total avoidance of extras and fun foods. Choose mostly whole grain, high fibre carbs. Avoid carbs. Our patients choose the things that help them to feel safer. So when they read this guide, they get filled with fear and anxiety, and it just makes things more challenging for them. All right, let's move on because we've got a whole bunch of myths to go through. Myth 2, you don't need carbs at every meal, right? Carbohydrate is the essential macronutrient that we use as fuel every day. The body cannot function without it, and I think that's the most important message that the room needs to remember. It keeps metabolic processes in a well-nourished and not starved state. Without them, the body goes into a starvation mode, and that's not what we want to be happening in our patients. The brain relies on glucose as its sole fuel resource. It's the key thing that the brain is looking for to keep it going. And in fact, there are all these backup mechanisms that go on in the body. If there isn't enough carbohydrate, if there isn't enough glucose in the blood at any one point in time, the body starts making its own glucose because it needs it. It's that important. You die if you don't have glucose at a certain level in your blood at all times. It keeps you feeling satisfied and nourished as well, rather than deprived. How many people have either experienced themselves or seen others in the room who have tried low-carb diets and felt absolutely shocking during it and unable to think and feel terrible and can't cope? There's a reason for this. It is also the essential fuel for all work done in the body. Everything that requires energy, every little process that occurs in the body needs fuel, it needs glucose. Muscle repair, cell building, metabolic processes, etc. And carbohydrates provide our main source of fibre as well. So if you take out a whole heap of carbohydrate, it is really hard to get the fibre you need each day. All right, brings me to myth 3. But some carbs are better than others, right? We all know that added sugar is bad, fructose is terrible, and we should be aiming for low glycemic foods, right? Sweet potato is better than white potato, added white sugar is bad, limit those of perceived lower value. And really that's often what we do believe, that we need to avoid those of a lower perceived value. But really the important thing to remember is that carbohydrates are all carbohydrates. High fructose is bad. So we keep hearing this lately in the media. So although there is some evidence that excessive fructose can contribute to metabolic complications like insulin resistance, fatty liver, etc., too much of anything can be bad for you. If you lived off of apples all day long, I can guarantee you would not be feeling healthy and your body would not be healthy. If you consumed, I don't know, think of another example. Let's say you had fish all day long and that's all you ate was fish. Likewise, although we know that fish is, sure, it's got lots of good things about it, eating that all day long, you're going to be missing a whole heap of nutrients there too, and eventually things are going to start going wrong in your body and you're probably not going to feel great. More randomised control trials are needed in order to make conclusions about fructose. At the moment, they don't exist. High glycemic index foods are bad. Well, really, that's not true either. Really, it's about the quantity of carbohydrates that is the most important, not so much the quality of the carbohydrate. So even if you're someone who has diabetes, it's going to come down to quantity first and quality second. But really, it is primarily a concern for those with insulin resistance or with type 2 diabetes, issues that are affected directly by that, not for the general population. And really, it also comes down to glycemic load, and that tends to be even more important. It's not usual that you're going to go out and just have a bowl of white rice all on its own and nothing else to eat. Usually if you're having rice, you're going to be having a whole bunch of other things with it. You're going to have some protein in there, you're going to have some flavours and sauce that you've made up with your lovely stir fry, you're going to have some veggies and who knows what else is in that mixture of vegetables. So it'll be a mixed meal of some sort. Well, all of those things add up together and create the glycemic load. So it's not just automatically a high glycemic index meal when there's a whole mixture of other things in there. So don't get too caught up in that. All right, myth 4. A high protein diet is healthier. And I have to say, my slides, these points up the top, these were meant to be the biggest, but somehow my font sizes have been reversed on this, so I'm not quite sure what's happened there. But the jury is out on high protein diets. So although protein stimulates satiety hormones like CCK and PYY, fat does it even more so. And furthermore, there is some initial evidence that high protein diets in combination with high intensity resistance training may increase lean muscle mass in athletes. But that's in athletes. That's not really that relevant to everyone else in the population. I mean, there's not that many people out there that are doing intense resistance training every day. Some of our patients, perhaps. But, you know, more than that, in having that high protein diet, they may be missing out on other macronutrients as well. And in fact, there is research that shows that a high protein, low carbohydrate diet has been linked to increased mortality rates. So we can't just jump in there and start making these drastic changes and advocating for these things. The research is still in its infancy in a lot of these areas. And yet the media grabs onto them and puts it out there and makes you think that we know that this is true, but we don't. A plant-based diet is healthier than an animal-based diet. Gosh, that's getting tiny. You can't even read that up there. I don't know what's happened. I'll read it for you. It says plant-based diets may have a detrimental effect on diet quality. And that's the message I wanted you to take home, that really tiny one that's there. So every individual has their own health concerns and needs. In clinical practice, people often really struggle to meet their iron requirements. They feel tired all the time, lethargic. I'm sure all of you would know someone who's tried a vegetarian diet and couldn't stick with it because they felt so bad. It happens frequently. And when they've actually done research into the nutritional adequacy of these diets, they've found that nutritional balance is often really poor with inadequate consumption of protein, iron, B12, zinc, omega-3, magnesium. And these are in big population-based studies as well. The NHANES study is a huge study from the US. Looking at vegan diets, this other really large prospective study of 30,000 participants found that vegans had the lowest energy intakes of all diets, which it sort of makes us understand a little bit why some of our patients might want to try and take on a vegan diet. They also have a very high prevalence of B12 and iodine inadequacy. And looking at the NHANES study, there was a research paper that came out that thought they'd look at doing some diet modelling based around what the 12 to 19-year-old girls did in that study. So it's still a really massive database that they were looking at. And they thought, well, what happens if, just from a diet modelling perspective, we increase or we shift the consumption of certain foods in that diet? And how does that change their adequacy? Does it improve things or decrease things? So in looking at these girls, they increased their plant-based food consumption by 100% to see what would happen. And it increased fibre, sugar, vitamin E, iron and folate. But what it did do was it decreased their total fat, their zinc, their vitamin D, and most concerningly, their calcium and protein intakes. So on a 12 to 19-year-old girl, that's the last thing you want to have happening when they're meant to be developing their bone health, developing their brain. And when they tried to increase protein-rich plant foods by 100%, it made very little difference because they were hardly having any in the first place. So is there anyone telling them out there that they need to do that if they were going to even try that? That's the other question. I can't tell you the number of times in clinical practice I've had vegetarian girls, teenage girls come to me wanting to be vegetarian or already vegetarian and getting stuck in their eating disorder, but they're not even having protein in their meals, and their families don't realise that they need to give it to them either. Particularly if the family's not vegetarian and aren't used to vegetarian diets, they don't realise that they need to be giving their kids protein in their meals. And if they increase dairy foods by 100% in this modelling, it increased vitamin D, magnesium, zinc, calcium, potassium, energy, saturated fat and protein. That looks like the best scenario, really. That's what we should be doing with teenagers, isn't it? And then, just to really think about, is a plant-based diet healthier than an animal-based diet? There has been research that's looked at a vegetarian diet and comparing it to diets with small amounts of red meat, and both were associated with a reduced risk of heart disease and type 2 diabetes. One wasn't better than the other. And there's very limited evidence that a vegetarian diet prevents cancer. And that's the other big scare out there that a lot of people are worried about. But the evidence isn't there. All right, next myth. Myth number 6. Gluten could be the cause of your gut issues. A lot of people think this, right? It's a big worry for a lot of people, and a lot of people just start following a gluten-free diet because they think things will all get better. So again, really tiny up here, but I'm going to read that out to you. In patients with eating disorders, it is more likely malnutrition and anxiety that are associated with gut issues. Gluten is a problem for about 0.5 to 1% of the population, which is primarily those people with celiac disease. And really, it's often gluten that's blamed when it's not actually gluten. It's malabsorption of fermentable sugars, so FODMAPs, some of you may have heard of, which is often used these days, or people are put on a FODMAPs diet, a low FODMAPs diet, when irritable bowel syndrome is picked up. That can more often be the cause of gut issues than gluten, and people don't realise the difference or how they, where does gluten even fit in that picture? They don't understand that relationship. This is where a dietitian could probably help you out. And I think what's also interesting, people are so worried and scared about gluten. Actually, gluten consumption has been linked to a lower risk of type 2 diabetes, probably because of the fibre. It's very hard to get enough fibre when you're on a low gluten diet. But when you really think about our patients and the gut symptoms that they have, it's probably not to do with gluten, because it's probably more likely to do with malnutrition and anxiety. We know that there's an increased prevalence of gut symptoms in eating disorder patients, and particularly in anorexia, and we know that with refeeding, they go away, they improve. And that same would apply to atypical anorexia. Or even if you were seeing someone in a larger sized body who had tried to lose loads of weight and had rapidly lost weight, they can get the gut symptoms as well. So it's not about BMI. Okay, that's not meant to look like that either. All right, good versus bad. Let's have a think about that, because I think you pointed out at the beginning, everyone thinks that some foods are good for you, some foods are bad for you. Foods are not intrinsically good or bad. These are values formed from media messages, family habits, and personal beliefs. No food is good or bad for everyone. Everyone has really different nutritional needs. So a person with cystic fibrosis, for example, needs a lot of salt in their diet. So they can't follow a low salt plan that's recommended by the government. A person with diabetes needs carbohydrates regularly. This is another myth that abounds out there, that they think they need to have no carbs, but that's not actually helpful. A person with inflammatory bowel disease might need a low fibre diet at times and a high fibre diet at other times. A person with hemochromatosis might need less red meat in their diet, whereas a person with iron deficiency anemia might need more red meat in their diet. Things aren't just good and bad. Which kind of then leads into this, that fun foods aren't everyday foods. Again, it's another one of those messages that's kind of implied by the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. So let me do a poll of the room here. Put your hands up. Who in the last 24 hours has had some chocolate? Excellent. Fun foods are not everyday foods. You naughty, naughty people. Who in the room has had some soft drink in the last 24 hours? How many people have had potato or corn chips? How many people have had lollies? What about cake? I'm going to put my hand up there too. Morning tea, yeah, there we go. Pastry, baked goods, yeah. Biscuits, oh yeah, I did. Pizza, takeaway food, hamburgers, ice cream, dessert, hot chips. Oh, mints, better put them down there too, right? Got to freshen our breath. Okay, now, here's the next question. Who in the room had none of those things in the last 24 hours? There's like, what, 2% of the room? Maybe 3%? So for the most part, people are having these foods every day. We're not all bad people because we've had these foods, and I'm pretty sure we're not all unhealthy either. We normally eat this stuff as part of a regular diet, and that's okay and that's allowed, and we are meant to enjoy food, and I think it's really important that we make sure that our patients can eventually learn to enjoy food again. Let's talk about dairy now. full-fat dairy is bad for you. This can be a hard one to argue against because there are so many reasons that patients can come up with as to why they might be doing this. So full-fat dairy increases the risk of heart disease. That can be a pretty scary belief. But let's put it out there, full-fat dairy does not increase the risk of heart disease. Really recent study, 2017, European Journal of Epidemiology. Meta-analysis combining data from 29 prospective cohort studies. So they've pulled together everything that's been done. High-fat dairy intake was not associated with risk of all-cause mortality, coronary heart disease, or cardiovascular disease. And dairy, whether high-fat or low-fat, has a neutral effect on cardiovascular risk. It's safe to have. Go for it. Enjoy. It could be contributing to your high mucus production. That's another worry that a lot of people seem to have, that full-fat dairy is going to do that. Cow's milk does not lead to mucus production or asthma, and there is research to back that up too. This particular study that I've put up here, there are quite a number of them, but this particular one I chose because it looked at the perceived changes that people had in mucus production. And interestingly, they all thought that it increased mucus production from both cow's milk and soy milk. So it's clearly not about cow's milk, is it? Also, if they had a common cold, it didn't increase then either. You'd think there'd be a lot of mucus going on with a common cold. And they also found that it didn't exacerbate asthma symptoms. The fat is upsetting your stomach. That's also a common fear that a lot of our patients have. But what it is more likely is that a patient's stomach is upset, as I said before, due to malnutrition and impaired gut function, particularly if there's significant disordered eating going on. So a study in the Journal of Pediatrics looked at females with anorexia and 22 healthy controls, and they studied the patients again after 3 to 4 months of refeeding. And adolescents with anorexia had impaired gastric accommodation, more somatic complaints, and more gut symptoms, basically, is what that's standing for. And after nutritional rehabilitation, everything improved. In my own research, which we're hopefully going to be publishing later this year, we looked at 22 females with anorexia and 17 healthy controls. Patients were studied at week 0 when they're in a starved state and then after 2 weeks of refeeding. And we found that slower gastric emptying and more GI symptoms were present in all of the starved patients, but not in the controls. And after just 2 weeks of refeeding, the gastric emptying had already improved. Gut symptoms hadn't quite improved yet, but it was only after 2 weeks. Whereas we can tell that after the 3 to 4 months, that's when you really get more improvement. So our patients have to stick in there. It takes time. There's a lot of damage that's occurred during malnutrition. I think that's the important thing to remember. You can still gain weight without it, right? You don't need full-fat dairy to gain weight. It's actually very, very difficult for underweight patients to meet their nutrition requirements for weight gain without full-fat dairy. In clinical practice and food modelling, Susan Hart and Caitlin McMaster have recently designed the Real Food Guide for helping support patients through eating disorder recovery. And they've created a food model, essentially, an alternative to the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, which I'm not going to go through today, but one interesting thing that they found, because they had to do food modelling to design the actual food pyramid that they came up with, they found that it's almost impossible to achieve 30% energy intake from fat if you're drinking low-fat milk. So then you can't even meet your requirements. And also from clinical experience, we know that patients tend to prefer the full-strength, full-fat dairy rather than having to have a much larger serve of low-fat milk to get the same amount they would otherwise, to get the same nutrition. I think it's a significantly greater amount in volume that they'd need to have, and they often don't want to do that. So let's talk about some other things related to dairy, but really twisting it a little bit. Now let's think about bone density. Calcium tablets and oral contraceptives will improve bone density. Now, this is one of those things that we come across in clinical practice quite a lot, where patients have lost their period and their doctors put them on the oral contraceptive pill to try and help them with their bone density. But actually, the literature does not support that as being helpful. Research indicates that calcium supplementation, first of all, does little to restore bone density or prevent further deterioration. We also know that other treatments have marked disadvantages. Bone density is best restored by returning a person to a healthy weight where their normal sex hormones and their normal fertility function are resumed. And as I said, the oral hormone replacement, although it may prevent further deterioration, it doesn't reliably restore bone density and may actually mask the resumption of menses. So you can't tell when a person might be getting a little bit better. It doesn't mean that they're recovered once they've started getting their period again. I think many of us that are more experienced in the room would have seen patients that have never lost their period and might be a BMI of 13 and still going along fine from that perspective. So that's not even one of the diagnostic criteria anymore. There is some new evidence that's starting to come out. There's one or two studies that have been done suggesting that transdermal estrogen might be helpful in improving bone density in very severe cases, and bisphosphonates have been trialled as well. But that's a very new, watch this space. I wouldn't say it's time to change clinical practice just yet. Myth number 11, you should have 8 cups of water a day. We should all drink lots of water, right? It's really important. Drink when you're thirsty. Drink more when you sweat more, and your body will take care of itself. That's the take-home message I'd like you to go with. Everything you eat contains some water, and raw fruit and veg have lots of it in there. It can account for about 20% of your fluid intake, in fact. Non-alcoholic drinks mostly contain water and contribute to hydration as well. You don't have to think that hydration can only come from water. If you've had tea, milk, juice, etc., it all counts. And caffeinated drinks don't dehydrate you either. They definitely contribute to your fluid intake. But I think what's most important is there is really no firm science to support the recommendation that you should have 8 cups of water a day. It doesn't exist. It's kind of made up. Fluid needs really depend on age, weight, physical activity, health, climate even. You know, if you're in a really hot environment, you're going to need a lot more water. In the middle of summer, we all want to drink more. But that comes back to, again, you should really listen to your thirst. That'll be your best guide for the most part. The best guidance really does come from within. Urine can also be a bit of a guide. If you've got really dark urine, that might mean that you're a bit dehydrated. If you've got really pale urine, you're well hydrated. That can be a guide. But otherwise, just listen to your thirst. Myth number 12, a child is just a picky eater. They'll grow out of it. So I wanted to put this in there just since we've now got ARFID as one of our diagnostic categories for feeding and eating disorders. I thought it was important not to just miss this one, because frequently in clinical practice we certainly come across patients who have been picky for a very long time and no one has mentioned to them that this could be a problem. Not growing out of picky eating is a serious problem, and about 8% don't. They don't grow out of it. In this study, in the Eating Behaviours Journal, they found that about 20% of 11-year-old children have selective eating. And about 60% of those grow out of it within 2 years. And those who don't, so the 8 in 100, are less willing to try new foods, have stronger food preferences, and have more family conflict around food selections. early prevalence and epidemiological studies suggest that 9 to 27% of eating disorder patients may actually have ARFID, but they haven't been given that diagnosis yet. Concerns about eating behaviours at any age, with or without weight loss, should be taken seriously with close monitoring to optimise early intervention. And I think it's also important to point out that a diagnosis of ARFID doesn't have to involve weight loss. There could be other types of malnutrition going on there that need to be considered. So just very quickly, I want to put up this case example just for you to consider. And this is a patient that I'd seen recently. So Heidi was a small baby, but health professionals did not express any concern. She had a peanut allergy diagnosed at 2 years old. She became increasingly selective with eating and avoided many foods. Hasn't seen a dietitian at this point. She struggled to put on weight, and by 10 years old, she was shorter than most of her peers. Health professionals still did not express concern to the parents, still hadn't seen a dietitian at this point, or anyone else to address these issues. Fussy eating continued, and parents would cook an entirely different meal for her at dinner from what the rest of the family was having. By 16 years old, she still had not had a period and had not grown taller than when she was 11. So she was growth stunted now. Heidi was becoming increasingly anxious and avoidant of social activities with friends due to her food anxieties. Now, there are so many, she's had 16 years of life where someone could have pointed out to her that there might be a problem here, but nothing was intervened, nothing was considered. All right, myth 13. They will eat when they're ready. Let's focus on the underlying factors. This often happens in eating disorder treatment, where the nutrition isn't targeted at the beginning. And so I hope you can see this at the back, but it's a bit of a table to show what sort of nutritional consequences might be present in different types of eating disorders. So an eating disorder with significant weight loss or significantly underweight, anorexia, atypical anorexia, you might have restricted food intake as their dietary pattern, restricted macro and micronutrients. The nutritional consequences of this might include having protein energy malnutrition, iron deficiency, B12 deficiency, inadequate calcium. And these can certainly affect the eating disorder and maintain their impact on the eating disorder. Eating disorders with dysregulated eating behaviour can also have effects on nutrition. They might have irregular food intake and variable quantities going in. They might have restricted micronutrients, distorted macronutrient profile could be present. They might have excess energy intake as well. That could be a problem. Nutritional consequences might include calcium, iron, B12 deficiency, excess high GI carbohydrates or saturated fat intake. Every individual's different, but they really do need to be explored. You can't just ignore these things. All right, myth 14. If a child is overweight, start them on a diet. This happens a little bit as well, doesn't it? And again, everyone in the room's coming from different backgrounds. But we could see this in so many different contexts as well. Even with our own families and social circles, we might see this. Parents become really worried, and not surprisingly, with all the messages that they get from the media. So for most children and adolescents, weight maintenance is the goal, not weight loss. And I think that's the important thing that keeps getting forgotten at the moment. Evidence is growing that weight loss and dieting is not the solution to body or weight concerns, particularly those arising from weight teasing and bullying, which is often the cause these days. Kids are learning from their environments and messages that they're hearing around them, that they're feeling like a higher weight is bad, and so bullying and teasing is happening more and more, and it's a problem. Adolescents who diet for weight loss show higher weight and higher rates of eating disorders at 5-year follow-ups. So if we actually look at the guidelines the clinical practice guidelines that are put out by the NHMRC for the management of obesity in adults, adolescents and children, what they say for children and adolescents is this. For children and adolescents who are overweight or obese, recommend lifestyle change, including reduced energy intake and sedentary behaviour, increased physical activity and measures to support behavioural change. But you need to think about the whole context with this and how it's done. Current Australian dietary and physical activity guidelines should be used as the basis of advice on dietary intake, physical activity and sedentary behaviour for children and adolescents. Approaches within a family approach have the strongest evidence. So think, even for those of you who've done FBT training before, think about the approach you might take there. How might that be similarly applied in this setting? Something to think about. For most children and adolescents, the goal is not weight loss, as I said, but it's actually weight stabilisation. They're in a peak time of growth and they need to be allowed to grow. And if they're on a restricted diet, if they're put on a diet that gives them a negative energy balance, they're not going to be able to grow appropriately. Their bones are at risk, their brain is at risk. They need to be allowed to grow normally. For postpubertal adolescents with a BMI greater than 40, laparoscopic adjustable gastric banding via specialist bariatric paediatric teams may be considered if other interventions have been unsuccessful in producing weight loss. Now, that is what the guidelines state. There are lots of people who are still feeling very uncomfortable with that, and rightfully so. So I think watch this space for how these guidelines might change in the future too. So what do they actually say in terms of advice to support healthy eating in children? I'm going to read this out and then I want you to think about what are they doing and what are they not doing. Take a family approach to improving nutrition and be a good role model. Ensure children have regular meals, including breakfast and snacks, in a social atmosphere. Whenever possible, eat meals as a family. Separate eating from other activities, such as watching television or using a computer. Encourage children to listen to internal hunger cues and to eat to appetite. Have healthy foods readily available. Avoid being restrictive or controlling of your child's food intake. Explain the concept of foods that are appropriate often or sometimes. Avoid using foods as treats or rewards. Comfort children with attention, listening and affection instead of food. Encourage children to develop healthy ways of regulating emotions that don't involve food. How similar is that to what we see in clinical practice? These are the guidelines, but I don't actually know that this happens that often. When I have patients referred to me, parents that are worried about the weight of their kids, this isn't the approach that's been taken already. It doesn't tell you to cut out certain foods or limit certain things, like not allow your kids to have the fun foods that we were talking about that everyone has every day. So we have to really think through what the advice is actually telling us and the messages that we're giving to our kids. Are we instilling them with fear, or are we supporting them to listen to their bodies? All right, myth 15. The microbiome can inform dietary intake. This is everywhere at the moment. I think there was even something the other week on obesity and the microbiome. And I even had a client contact me the other day wanting to know if I could assess their microbiome and change their dietary intake in the context of treating the eating disorder. I was quite surprised that this had even come up. All right, so just a few little basics on the microbiome. So far, it has only been investigated in anorexia nervosa. And just so that we're all sort of up to speed, the intestinal microbiota includes the community of microorganisms such as bacteria, archaea, fungi, parasites and viruses that reside within the human GI tract. Trillions of microbes, equating to a 1-to-1 ratio of human to bacteria cells, with the greatest density and diversity found in the lower GI, so the lower gut. And it's different in every person. It's a bit like the human genome. Everyone is different. But the composition is influenced by many, many factors. Genetics, diet, health status, age, sex, where you live, drug exposure, medicines, so many different factors. So what have they done in anorexia? There was a small study, you can see the numbers there, where they looked at microbial diversity, and they found that there was a lower diversity in anorexic patients compared to, and post-refeeding as well, compared to healthy controls. There was another study, a little bit bigger, in 55 anorexic patients compared with normal healthy weight controls, and they found profound microbial perturbations and elevated branched-chain fatty acid concentrations, which are all related together. And they found there were distinct differences between restrictive anorexia and binge purge subtype. And with weight gain, they found that there was an increased richness, but the disturbances in microbiota did not recover. And again, I don't think you can see this slide at all. It's quite small on this screen. But this is, you can look up the reference though, where it's from, the paper. But basically it's suggesting that there are lots of possible different ways that the microbiome might be affected in anorexia nervosa. But I think really what I want you guys to think about is this. I've only talked about 2 studies. There are not many studies in anorexia nervosa. There's research being done, but it's in its infancy. So far, what we know about the microbiome is really looking at correlation, not causation. It doesn't say if you do this, this happens. It doesn't say that. A lot of the research that's being done in this area is in animals. It's in rat studies and other animals. It's not necessarily generalizable to humans. We don't even know that. Also, microbial detection is not the same as the microbiome. So what they're actually picking up in their sampling can be affected by all kinds of sampling technique issues. So it's not necessarily exactly what we're hearing about in the microbiome. And really, if you ask me, it's leading to more questions than answers. It's a bit like opening Pandora's box. It's great that we've realised that there's all this diversity down there, but we know so little about it. What's really of concern, I think, is that there has been a lot of commercialisation based around this research that's being done. It's almost introduced a whole other functional food group. We're seeing it everywhere on supermarket shelves, yogurts and drinks that have fermentation and bacteria, probiotics in them and all kinds of things. But there's very little quality control with any of that. There's lots of different manufacturing processes, and there aren't trials to say that this X does Y. We don't know that. And probiotic research is often misreported in the media. Really, you only see the positive results in the media. And in reality, RCTs also use very specific bacteria strains, and it's very difficult to then pull the results together and look at how all the studies are similar when they're all looking at different things. So it's really just in its infancy. So I definitely wouldn't be changing anything in clinical practice for a long, long time to come. All right. Myth 16. If the number on the scales goes up, body fat must have increased, right? My advice is if the number on the scales goes up, wait and see. Many factors may affect weight gain at any one point in time. So first of all, time of day. Weight will always be lower in the morning and higher in the afternoon or evening, after more food and fluid have been consumed. Always weigh patients at a similar time of day. For example, if you're seeing them after breakfast, keep it consistent. Otherwise, you're just going to get confused, as well as them getting stressed. Menstrual cycle. weight naturally fluctuates throughout the menstrual cycle in women. It can be up to anywhere from 0 to 7 kilos really difference each month. And it usually happens at the end of the luteal phase and during the first few days of menstrual flow due to fluid retention. Hydration changes are also often present and can get confused in there. If a patient has drunk more or less, this will certainly affect their weight. If a patient has vomited in the last 24 hours, this may lead to either over or under hydration, depending on their vomiting behaviours and their body's response to the vomiting behaviours. If the patient has been sweating more, whether due to weather or sport, they may be more dehydrated as well. Bowel movements can also affect weight. Now, if a patient is really constipated, of course they're going to weigh more. Likewise, if they have diarrhoea, then they might be a bit dehydrated and have lots of food leaving them very quickly and rapidly. So that's going to drop their weight. Body composition changes are also something to bear in mind. If a patient has increased muscle mass, their weight may well increase. So something to think about. All right, myth 17. Patients need to be in the healthy weight range. People can be healthy above a BMI of 25, and that's really what I want you guys to take home. The BMI classifications that were developed by the World Health Organization for normal, 18.5 to 25, are based on prevalence data and statistics. It's a numbers game. That's what it is. It doesn't say that people are healthy. And I think on that, it's also really important to point out that there are task forces and investigations into whether that range, that quite large range, is relevant for everyone. There's thought that for Asian populations, actually the lower BMI range might be more relevant, but for Caucasians, you're not usually around the 18.5 to 19 BMI. That's not usually healthy. So really for our patients, if you're dealing with a Caucasian group, then I would be saying a BMI of 20 as a minimum. If we have a look at the research around what's healthy, 50% of individuals with a BMI of 25 to 30 are actually metabolically healthy. And this is from the NHANES study as well, of 40,000 participants. 30% of individuals in the obese range are metabolically healthy. And 30% of normal weight individuals are actually unhealthy from a cardiometabolic perspective. It's also important to think about athletes and other people with a higher muscle mass. So if you're dealing with a male patient, for example, that's got a high muscle mass, they're often going to be over a BMI of 25 and still healthy. And generally speaking, we now know that we are healthier at higher weights. There was a big study done in JAMA looking at 3 Danish cohorts through the 1970s, 1990s and 2000s and followed up until death. And they found that a BMI of 27 actually has the lowest risk of dying from any condition. There is also considerable weight bias that occurs in health professionals, in eating disorder health professionals. There was a study that surveyed health professionals and they looked at what they found in their study was that negative weight stereotypes were present among some professionals treating eating disorders. Most people had observed other professionals in their field making negative comments about obese patients. And 42% believed that practitioners who treat eating disorders often have negative stereotypes about obese patients, and that 29% reported that their colleagues had negative attitudes towards the obese. It doesn't really make it easy for our patients either, does it? And just something to reflect on, I think, in our own clinical practice. So finally, I don't know if you can see this properly, but just a word on those healthy foods as my final slide. Some last take-home messages. Spinach and leafy greens contain minimal iron. Pumpkin does not contain enough carbohydrate. Carrots definitely don't have enough carbohydrate. A few strawberries, not a serve of fruit. Vegetable juice is not the same as fruit juice. Neither almond nor coconut milk have adequate protein or carbohydrate. Quinoa does not have as much protein as meat. And mushrooms are not a source of protein. That's everything I've got to tell you today, but I think the really important thing that I hope I've brought up for you is that there are so many things that we believe just through our experiences and through the media, so many mixed messages out there. The best thing you can probably do is refer your patients to a dietitian, because we know about this stuff and we can help unmuddle some of the messes and confusion that are out there with beliefs around food. So thank you very much, everyone.